In this video, I'm going to show you how you can Dockerize a React project. So we're going to be using React, Docker, and Vite, which is going to be what we're going to use to run and create our React project. We'll start by creating a new React project, but we're going to do this through Docker. Then we're going to set up Docker to be able to run our project and sync the files from our project to the running server in Docker. And then we're going to configure Vite so that it can properly serve our application and that we can access it in the browser on our local machine. So let's get started. We're going to start by creating our project. So I'm going to assume that we're going to create a brand new project for the purposes of this course. I recommend you do the same just so you can learn the concepts. And then if you wanted to apply this to an existing project, you should know how to do that by the end of this tutorial. So we're going to start by opening up the terminal, or if you're on Windows, you're going to use the PowerShell, or ideally the subsystem for Linux if you know how to use that. But you should be able to do this just using PowerShell on Windows as well. Before we continue, you need to make sure that you have Docker installed. So you can either use Docker Desktop and just download that off the Docker website. You want to make sure that you have the latest version because we're going to be using some relatively recent features of Docker Compose for the purpose of this tutorial. Once you have Docker installed, go ahead and open up the terminal or the PowerShell window and then navigate to the location you want to create your project. So I'm just going to go mkdir and create a new directory called sample react. Now, of course, you can call the project whatever you want, and if you prefer, you can create that in the Explorer manually. It just simply creates a directory that we can use. Then I'm going to change into the directory, and we're going to start by running a Docker command to create our React project. Now, most people, if you've used Node or React before, you're probably familiar with just running npm create command directly on your machine. You could go ahead and do that. However, I like to run all of the commands through Docker. There are a few reasons for this, but one of them is consistency. I want to make sure that everybody that's running this, that's following this tutorial, has the same version and is using the same version of Node and Vite that I am also using for the steps, just to make sure the steps are consistent when you're following along. And this doesn't just apply to online tutorials, this is also really useful for in the workplace as well, because many times you might join a company and you open up the project to start working and you find that the README file is totally out of date. Everybody has different versions of different things all over the place, and the steps that you're following in the README are just so hard to follow, and it just doesn't work basically because it was written so long ago and it hasn't been maintained and updated. So I like to run everything through the wrapper of Docker because that means the steps that I write down are going to be consistent. When you run this command, it should work exactly the same as it works for me today at the time of recording this video. It does mean that we need a slightly longer command in order to create the project, but we're going to go ahead and do that, and I'll talk you through what each of the pieces of the command mean. So we're going to type docker run --rm --it. I'm just going to type it all out and then I'll explain each component after that. There's also a link in the resources of the video to our website, which will take you to a page where you can actually see the command in text form, which might be useful if you're following along and you're finding it hard to get all the characters correct. Okay, so we have docker run --rm --it. It should actually be just one hyphen there. So docker run --rm -it. And then -v, and then we're going to do the $, and then open the brackets here, pwd, close the brackets, :/code, and then -w /code, and then node :22.11, and then sh-c, going to open up the quotes here, and then inside the quotes we're going to type npm create vite at 5.4, and then front end --, and then space, you're going to do --template react, and then double ampersand here, cd front end /, and then ampersand npm install. Okay, so what this command is going to do is it's going to run docker run, which is just the command for running Docker containers. It's going to specify --rm, which means after it runs the container, remove the container. The container just needs to exist for the purposes of running this command. Once it's finished, we can remove it from the system, and it's an optional thing to specify. However, if you don't specify that, then every time you run this docker run command, it's going to create a new container. It's just going to sit on the system. So just to keep things clean, we have the --rm to remove it after the execution is complete. And then we have hyphen with a single hyphen it, and this passes the I and the T flags to the docker run command, and essentially what that means is it allows us to run it in interactive mode. So that means when the command runs, if the input is required from the command, so for example it asks you to hit Y to continue, then that can be done interactively in the terminal, and that needs to be provided in order to be able to interact with the command as it's running in Docker. Then we have this -v and then $pwd:/code. What this does is it essentially maps a volume from our current directory, which is the sample React directory on our system, to the /code directory on the containers file system. So the reason why we need to do that is so that we can, the files that are created inside Docker, which will be our new React project, are mapped back to our files on our system. We want to create the new project in Docker, and we want to map that back to the project directory that we're working from here. So we need to do that using a Docker volume, and that's specified using the -v argument here that we pass to the command. Pwd says take the present working directory or the current directory that we're working from and pass that in, because in order to map a volume you need to have the absolute directory, so it can't be using the home location, or you can't do a relative location from where we're currently working from. It has to be absolute, so we use the pwd command, which will pull in the full path for our current working directory. Then we have -w, which is the work dir or the work directory, and that just means when we run the container, we want to run it from the /code directory on our containers file system. So essentially that means every command we run inside this Docker container that we're running, it will run it from that location, the same way as if you had done cd /code to change that directory first, except you don't need to do that because it runs everything from there by default. Then we specify the image. So node :22.111 is the image that we're going to run, and the tag 22.11 represents the version of node that we're going to run. And this is what's important or useful about using Docker to run these types of commands, is that when you document this, or when you're following this video, if you use this exact same version, then the outcome should be the same, regardless if Node have performed updates or released updates to newer versions. So essentially what it does is it means that everybody's using that same version of Node, regardless of what you have installed on your local machine. If you already have Node installed, then you could have any different version, and it might mean that the steps that you run are slightly different, which can create problems. So that's why I like to use Docker and pin the version here specifically. And then of course, as if you're working on a project and you have this as part of your README documentation, you would update that periodically to make sure you're using the most recent version. But as you do that, you would test that the command still works in the same way. Then we have this sh-c. So this essentially says run the following shell script command on the container that we run. So this is where we kind of separate the Docker syntax from the command that we're running inside Docker. It is actually optional. You could omit this sh-c and the quotation around the command. However, I just find that's a bit confusing when it comes to running the command, because it's hard to tell what's being run in Docker and what are the commands for running Docker itself. So then inside this sh-c, we have the npm create Vite 5.4 front end. So that is the command that's documented on the Vite website for creating a new template project for React. So we're doing npm create Vite. We're specifying the version here at 5.4. Again, same reason we did that for the Node version. We want to make sure that we're using the consistent version of Vite when we run this command. Typically you would use latest, but as I said, I like to pin the version just to make sure that the steps you're following are the same as the ones when I'm creating this video here. Then we have front end here. So that's the name of the project we're creating. You could call this whatever you want, but I recommend sticking with front end just for the purposes of this tutorial. So front end is the name of the project that we're going to create for our React project. Then we have this double hyphen, which is the syntax for passing additional commands to the npm create command. So we're going to pass in the template React. So the Vite command supports multiple different things. You can create a Vue project, Angular, React, and you can also create React in TypeScript format. It's all documented on their website, which I will link in the resources of the video. But essentially that defines the template, and for the purposes of this, we want to create a React project. Then we have the double ampersand, which is a way of chaining these different commands that we're going to run. So we want to run the npm create command first, and then after that we're going to run the cd front end, where we switch into the front end project directory that has just been created. Next we have another double ampersand to add an additional command. So after the first two commands run, we want to run npm install, and the reason for this is we want to install the npm packages and make sure that it's done inside Docker, but it updates the package.json file inside our local machine. So before I run this, I'm going to open up the project in my code editor, just so you can see the changes to the project that happen as we run the command. So we'll open this up. So right now, all we have is an empty directory, and we're going to run this command that I just talked through. It's very long, but I do think it's worth having the long command just for the consistency. Okay, so let's hit enter and we'll see if I made any errors. So it looks like it worked. On your version, it may or may not need to download this image first, which means it may take a few extra minutes depending on if you already have the node image cached on your local machine. I've obviously run this before, so I already have it cached, so it just kind of came up instantaneously. It's asking if we can install the create Vite package, and it's important to remember that it's asking if we can install this, but inside the Docker container. So it's not actually going to install it on our local machine. It's all completely isolated inside Docker. So I'm going to hit Y for yes, create. It's going to install the create Vite package. Hit enter, it goes ahead and installs that, and then it runs the command. And you can already see here, if you noticed, it created the front end directory, which it should be populating now with some files specific for our project. So we'll just wait for that to complete and then we'll continue. I should mention that if you're using Windows, then the pwd part of the command here needs to be uppercase, because that's just the syntax for using it on Windows essentially. Okay, so you can see that it has finished the command. It did give us some warnings, but this is all related to Vite. It's not related to anything we're doing specifically here. So if you go back to the project and you expand it, you can see it's created the front end project in our directory. So essentially it's the same as if you ran the command directly locally. So if you ran npm create and the Vite command here directly without specifying all the Docker things, as long as you had npm installed with the correct version, then it would work. However, this did this command, it ran it all inside the Docker container. So you don't even need to have node installed on your machine directly in order to follow this. Okay, so now we've created the project. The next step is we're going to be configuring Docker. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a few new files in the root of the project. So the first one is going to be called the Dockerignore file. So we'll type .dockerignore. And this is the file that's going to tell Docker which files to ignore when it's building things. So just make sure that you create it in the root of the project and not in the front end subdirectory. I like to separate it out in this way because then you have your front end code here and you can add your back end code here as well if you wanted, if you had back end services. But the Docker configuration all goes in the root of the project. So we have the Dockerignore file, and I'm just going to populate it here. So we're going to ignore the readme.md if you have one, and then the front end /node/modules, which is important because we want to exclude these node modules, because if you've ever worked on a node project before, you know that they can become quite huge, and it means that it all gets passed into the Docker context at build time, and because there can be such a large quantity of node modules, it often creates problems because it can slow things down, because it has to copy all of those files to the Docker builder in order to build our Docker image. So it's good practice to ignore any node modules that you have on your local machine from the Docker context if you can. So that's what we do here in the Dockerignore. So we'll save that. Next, we're going to add our Docker file. So we'll type Docker file, and I'll type it out and you can follow along, and then we will go through it line by line. So we'll type from node:22.11 and then copy ./frontend/frontend and then run rm-rf/frontend/node modules and then workdir/frontend, run npm CI and then cmd npm run dev. Okay, so this is our Docker file that contains the instructions that tell Docker how to build our Docker image. So we save the file. We have line 1, which is from node:22.11. This essentially is the base image that we're going to start from. So it's going to pull the node image from the Docker Hub, and we're going to start our image from that point. And specifically, we're going to be using version 22.11 of Node. Then we're going to copy the contents of our front end directory. So that's the front end folder here in our file system. It's going to copy that into the image. So the image starts with the current version of the code that is defined in our project. Then we're going to do run rm-rf/frontend/node modules. Now this may or may not be required. I think it is required because when we do the copy command, it may copy all of the node modules. We want to make sure that those node modules that were copied from our local machine are removed, because we may have a separate version of node modules on our image because it's using a different operating system than our local machine. So this is really just in case you do run Node directly locally on your machine and you start the project. You want to make sure that the Node modules that you have on your local machine are different or separated from the Node modules that are running in the container. Then we specify workdir, so that again changes the working directory. So the default working directory for this container or images or containers that are made from this image will be from the /frontend directory. So that's kind of the default working directory for containers that run from this image that we're using. Then we run npm CI, which is very similar to npm install, except it doesn't update the package lock.json file. It just installs exactly what's there. The reason why we do this is because during the build phase, you can't map changes back from the build phase back into the local file system. So we want to make sure that the package.lock file is the actual one that's being used inside our Docker image. This just helps create consistency, because if you do npm install, then it may install the dependencies, but you wouldn't know, you might be using a different package lock JSON file on your local machine versus in the Docker image. And the problem with this is that it just can create some unexpected issues, because you may have slightly different versions of things running locally than you have on your Docker image. So if you were to run the project directly on your local machine, then that may create a few problems. So I like to use npm CI for the build phase of the Docker file. Then we specify the command, which is npm run dev, which runs the dev command that's specified in the scripts here, which just simply runs Vite, which the way that works is it basically starts the server. So that's the default command in Vite for starting the development server. And that's going to be the default command that we run. We can override it if you went to deploy this, and you might override it, or you may update this command to be the production server. The development server you override in the Docker compose file, but we don't need to worry about that for now. We're just going to set it to default as the development server. Okay, next what we're going to do is create the Docker compose file. So we'll do docker-compose.yaml. And then we're going to type services, front end, build, and then context, and then ports has to be level with build here. It's important to get the indentation correct here. The indentation is how Docker Compose or interprets YAML files. It's basically the syntax of a YAML file. It requires indentation to separate certain blocks. So we're going to define ports, and then we're going to do -5173:5173. And then we're going to type develop : and then watch : and then -action : sync, and then path colon dot forward slash front end, make sure I spell it correctly, and target colon forward slash front end, and then ignore colon hyphen node hyphen modules. Okay, so let's talk through this file here. So we have a standard Docker Compose file. If you haven't used Docker Compose before, then it's basically broken down into different services that run. We define our services using the services block that we define on line 1. And then on line 2, we specify the name of the service. In our case, we only have one service and it's called front end. Then we specify on lines 3 and 4 the build context. So this essentially tells Docker Compose what the context for our build is going to be. We're using the period symbol here, so just a plain old dot on line 4, and that says the context is the root of the project. So the same directory that the Docker Compose file is being run from is the context for our build, and essentially what that means is it will use our default Docker file in the project to run this service or to build this service. You may change the build context here, the definition. You may put a different directory instead of just the period symbol to a subdirectory if you had different services that use different things. So for example, if you had a backend service that had its own Docker file inside the backend subdirectory, you would change that to backend. Then we map the ports. So when you run Docker, it has a completely isolated network system and a completely isolated file system and everything. So when you're running it, if you need to connect into the Docker container, you need to tell Docker Compose to map the ports that you need to access. So what this does here on line 5 and 6 is we say map the port 5173 on our local machine to the network port 5173 on our running container for this service. So that way, when you go ahead and try and access this port, it connects into the network that is running our Docker container and allows us to access the application that is running on port 5173 on our Docker container. The reason why we choose 5173 is because that is the default port for the Vite server. If you're running this in production, you may change it to a different port number. If you're using something like Next.js, I believe it uses port 3000, but essentially you need to map any ports that you need to access in your container. Then we specify develop watch. So this is kind of the new approach to syncing files from our local machine into the running Docker services. So previously, before the watch functionality was available in Docker, you would have had to use a volume. And you may be familiar with trying to map a volume, and you may or may not have experience doing it for a node project before. I've done it on a node project before, and it used to be quite a nightmare because what would happen is it wouldn't sync the files properly, it wouldn't trigger the reload properly, it would be inefficient and slow, and it would there's lots of issues with mapping a volume and using that to auto reload a node service in Docker. Now you have this watch functionality, which allows you to set up a one-way synchronization from our local machine to the running container. And it's specifically designed for development purposes and things like hot reloading of node servers, for example, like the Vite development server. So the way it works is you define the action. So there's different actions that are available. In our case, we're just using sync, but you could use reload or rebuild. Reload would restart, or maybe it's restart. You should reference the documentation, which I'll link into the video. Essentially, there's different actions you can choose from. Sync will just sync the files on our local machine to the ones inside the container. Restart and rebuild will, as the name suggests, they will restart the service, or they will rebuild the Docker image for the service. In this case, all we need to do is sync. Then we specify the path, which is the path on our local machine that we want to watch. So that is the front end directory that contains all of our React code. And then the target, which is the path inside the container that we want to sync the files to. So we're going to copy all of the files from our front end directory into the target. So this actually happens as part of the Docker file when you build the Docker image. However, once you built the Docker image, if you change the files, it doesn't automatically sync. So that's why we have this sync block here to automatically sync any changes that we make while we're developing our project into the running Docker container. Then we specify the ignore block here. So this says which files should we ignore when we're syncing them. And as I explained, node modules is a good one to ignore because node modules is a file that has specific modules for the operating system that the npm install command was run on. So if you ran node modules directly in here, you would have a different set of node modules than the one that you run inside the Docker container because we have different operating systems. So we're using Mac OS here, whereas in the Docker image, it's going to be using a Linux-based operating system. So essentially what it does is it says ignore this directory, don't listen for changes in it and sync them automatically because those should be kept separate from our local development. Okay, so now that's set up, we can move on to the next step. So the next step is we just need to make a minor configuration change to the Vite configuration. So if you locate the frontend/vite.config, and then below the plugins here, we're going to add a new line. We're going to type server : and then we're going to type the open brackets here, and we're going to type host : and then inside the double quotation mark 0.0.0.0.0, and then save the file. Okay, so the reason why we set this line is because by default, the Vite server will listen on the local host or the loopback network port. So what that means is that if you're running it directly on your local machine where you have a network that you're using, it will allow you to access that server on the local host address. Whereas if you're running this inside Docker, it has its own network. So it will start the server and it will listen for connections, but it will only listen for connections that initiate from inside the Docker container itself, which is obviously no good because we don't want to access this from inside the Docker container itself. We want to access it from our local browser on our computer. So in order to do that, we specify the host as 0.0.0.0, which tells the Vite server to listen on all network interfaces. So essentially, inside the Docker container, it'll be listening on all network interfaces, which will mean the server is accessible from the port that is mapped inside our Docker Compose file in the container. So we should be able to access the server from our local machine by using this mapped port. Okay, so once that's done, we're going to go ahead and actually create our server and try and see if it works. So go back to the terminal or the command prompt window, and all you need to do is docker compose up, but you need to specify --watch and --build. So docker compose up is the standard command that's used to start all of the services defined in our Docker Compose configuration. Then we specify watch, which enables this new watch functionality that we define in our Docker Compose configuration. So if you don't specify watch, then it won't watch the files. You need to manually specify watch when you run the Docker Compose up command. Then you pass in build, and this just tells it to build our image first, and it would build it automatically if it didn't exist, but it's useful to rebuild it every time in case you made changes to the project while the Docker service wasn't running and they weren't synced into the container. Okay, so we're going to hit enter, and you can see here it built the image. I already had it cached actually, so it's a lot faster for me than it probably would be for you. But the second time we run it, it should be this quick. Basically, it starts, you can see watch enabled here. So now if we go ahead and open up the browser, we can take a look at the server as it's running and we'll see if it works. So in order to access this, I'm going to use the local host address. So it's http://127.0.0.1:5173. You could probably just type localhost. I like to do it the long way around personally, but you could just use a local host address here. You can see it's running our server and we can access our server. This is just the template that's created by the Vite template. And the main thing we want to test is that it reloads, because this is the thing that lots of people have issues with when using Docker, and the thing that doesn't work so well when you use volumes instead of the watch sync functionality. So we're going to test that it reloads, and we're going to test that just by opening up the code, and we're going to go and pick a file inside the code that is in our React project. Let's just open up app.jsx and Vite React plus Docker, save the file. And you can see without doing any refreshing or restarting, it automatically updated in the browser. So you can see that it appears to be working here. Okay, so that's essentially how you Dockerize a React project and get it working with all of these file syncing and the auto reload. There is one caveat, because the watch functionality, unlike the previous volumes mapping that we would have used, the watch functionality only is one-way syncing. So it only synchronizes from our local machine to the Docker container, which is fine for when you're developing. Every time you make changes here, you want it to reflect inside the Docker container so that it refreshes the server here. So if you want to install a new package inside the Docker container, then we need to run a special command in order to make sure that the package.json file is synced back to our desktop. So what I'll do is I'll type in the command here. So it's docker compose run --rm -v, and then the $, open quote, pwd, and on Mac or Linux, pwd is lowercase. On Windows, you need to make that uppercase. And then you're going to do /front end, and then : /front end. And then we type sh, or type front end again for the name of the service, then sh-c npm install, and I'm going to install the package Axios. You obviously would change this to whichever package you want to install. So I'll just talk through this. We have the docker compose run command, which says docker compose run this command or run this service. And we're specifying RM to say after it's run, remove the container from the system because we don't want them building up and lingering. And then we have -v, which says map the volume. So we're going to map the volume from our present working directory, which is the sample React project in this case, /front end, which has our front end code. We're going to map that to /front end in our running container. Then we're going to specify the name of the service we want to run, which is front end, and then sh-c, and then the command that we want to run inside this service. So the reason we have to map the volume here is because unlike Docker, the watch functionality, which is great for syncing file changes from our project to the container, the volume allows us to sync data back from the container back to our project. So this is needed because when we run the npm install Axios command, it's going to run it inside the container, and it's going to make some changes to the files, specifically to the package-lock.json and the package.json. We want those changes to sync back to our project, so that's why we have to map a volume here. Whenever we want to run a command that's going to make changes to the project, we need to have a volume map so that those changes can be synchronized back to our project and we can commit it to Git or whichever source control you wish to use. So hit enter, you see it goes ahead and does the spinny line thing, and then it installs it. So it says it's installed successfully. It's added 10 packages, which is classic for Node. If you click on package.json, then you can see it's added Axios here automatically, and also in the package.json.lock it will be added here, but we won't go through this because this file is huge. But you just have trust that it's basically updated the package.json file and the package.lock.json file. Now, the last thing we need to do after installing packages, and only after installing packages, is we need to stop the server and we just need to start again with the build command. So it rebuilds the container. The reason we need to do that is because otherwise the package will be listed, but it won't be installed inside our actual running container that's running the service. Because when you run docker compose run, it just essentially installs it in that instance of the container. It doesn't install it in the same instance that we're running the server as here. So that's just the one thing to remember, is that if you ever install packages, which typically doesn't happen a lot in a project, usually you'll be working on the code a lot more than you'll be installing individual packages. Every time you install a package, you just need to remember to restart the server with the build flag so it rebuilds your Docker image. So that is how you set up a React project using Vite and Docker and Docker Compose. And hopefully you found this useful. This may be a bit of a unique way to do this. However, there are many, many benefits to doing it this way, like having a consistent development environment between all of the users who use your project. This is especially useful if you are doing the project for a company that has lots of different developers and you want to make sure everybody has a consistent development environment. It's also useful for streamlining your local development environment with your deployed environment. So we're not going to cover it in this lesson, but you can actually use this to do a deployment too. You can use the same Docker Compose or the same Docker config, the Docker file config, and you can use that same image that you're using locally now to do a production deployment. So thanks a lot for watching. If you have any feedback or comments, or there's things you liked or didn't like, please leave them in the comments below. Also, if you have any suggestions for content that you want us to create, please also leave that in the comments below. We do have a website where we link to courses where we go into more depth into these kind of topics. So please check that out and see if there's any courses there that you think might be useful. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.